The first thing he noticed was the heartbeat of the Earth going out of rhythm. Adeyemi sat alone in the pre-dawn stillness of the Ghana Geomagnetic Station, a concrete box at the edge of scrub, the air warm, the lights low to spare the instruments. He had listened to this hum for years, the soft, steady pulse of lines etched by the planet's field. A secret music without melody. He could tell when a storm brewed from the sun. He could tell when the technicians in Accra switched generators and the floor thrummed differently. But this was new. The noise didn't grow loud. It grew precise. 2. Pause. 3. Pause. 5. 7. 11. 13. Prime numbers. Counted, like someone knocking on the world. He leaned forward so hard his chair squealed. The waveform on the monitor stacked itself with an elegance that felt inhuman. The signal lasted just under a second. 0. 72, if the readout could be trusted. It was too clean. It was too intentional. He ran a verification script by muscle memory, even as every part of him knew no script could explain this. The instant the pulse ended, a second beep sounded from the back lab. The satellite downlink blinked awake with a message not meant for him. His breath fogged on cold steel as he read the header. Deep Space Network. Voyager 1. He didn't open it. It would open him. On the other side of the world, in a room so sterile that the air felt edited, a junior analyst stared at a different kind of silence. Mira Das had trained her eyes to read noise. Cosmic dust. Warm pixels. Sensor drift. She had learned to trust nothing at first glance. She had learned that the universe was generous with trickery but stingy with miracles. All the same, there are moments when the screen seems to decide for you, when your duty and your awe are the same breath. The James Webb Space Telescope had been scheduled to skim a partition of night above the Pacific, a window of darkness measured to the arcsecond, a patch where long integration time would stack and reveal galaxies like frost on glass. The first frames arrived. Then more. Stars pinned their coordinates. Mira rolled her neck, took a sip of coffee gone metallic, and clicked to overlay. There it was. Not a light. An absence. An oval no algorithm had room for. A hole that did not move, did not blur, did not soften at its edges as heat would. It simply refused to exist where existence was expected. It was shaped like intention. Or like a nail hammered clean through the image, straight through the geometry of expansion and background and the easy comfort of models. She thinned the background. She thickened it. She ran cross-calibration against the ground test frames. The whole stayed like a scar on reality. Her supervisor said nothing for a beat too long, then 3 beats more. The room became crowded with people who had keycards that could turn lights into secrets. The feed was cut with a precision she had never seen, and her monitor swallowed itself in a black square as if the room had lost its nerve. The engineer 2 desks over made a joke, because sometimes this is all you can do, and he was the sort of person who did that even when jokes were flares wasted at sea. Someone flipped a script. Servers began to wipe themselves with the efficiency of guilt. The words used for this sort of act are antiseptic. They taste of safety. Security measure. Integrity protocol. The feeling they leave is older. It is the sense of a door closing in your face on a hallway you did not know you were walking. Outside of rooms that cost money to enter and pride to leave, night kept being night. Chilean air thinned high over desert, and a private observatory run by a team of stubborn romantics, that is, astronomers without a grant, caught a shimmer where a shimmer should not be. South African mountains drank the light from half a sky and returned a report written in smudged ink. The reports were comparisons of absence, jotted in breathless shorthand and encrypted because hope made them cautious. The more they pointed, the less they saw. By the time the rumor spread into a shape, it had a name. It always works this way. We name what we fear, so that we can tell ourselves we are in the business of knowing. Someone must have thought it clever. Someone must have thought it honest. They called it Ni-Oumuamua. It did not arc. It did not fall. It hung. Its position was wrong. Geostationary, but not above the equator as every book insisted such a thing must be. Above the magnetic equator, that shifting ghost of a line the planet draws for itself. It took up a station where no neutral body had any business lingering, a balance point that did not exist in the old equations unless you were willing to write new ones with terms you had never believed would be needed.
No traces blade from it.
No exhaust. No heat signature with edges you could name. Instead, the air around it warmed and cooled the way a mind might, like a thermostat trying to remember a preference. A bubble formed and reformed, a cloak that actively forbade the environment to measure it cleanly.
The Objekt inverted Konventions.
It was not seen because we looked. It was seen because it refused to be ignored. The first wave rolled through the planet the way some notes roll through a piano and make strings stir without being touched. CERN's magnetometers, tuned to help a collider thread protons with needlepoint care, shivered all at once. An elegant 0.72-second curve, global, coherent, stitched into each log with a common timestamp so crisp it cut. It was not solar weather. It was not the whisper of a storm. It had the good manners of something that knows you are listening and does not want to be misunderstood. Hours later, as if the universe had a sense of theater that verged on cruelty, the Deep Space Network caught a handshake from a machine that should have had nothing left to say. Voyager 1 had been drifting toward the ragged hem of our neighborhood for longer than some of its caretakers had been alive. Its instruments had aged into a kind of dignified silence. What arrived did not fit into the body of that silence.
It was complex.
It was cut into packets that read like intentions. Primes nested in primes. The math had a cleanliness to it that made real scientists angry and true believers dizzy. It is one thing to receive an old friend's ghost. It is another to find the ghost as sharp as the day they left, with a vocabulary they never had. A team with more caution than assumptions split the packets. They found transformations that did not live in Voyager's code. They found corrections that felt like tiny forgivenesses for the limits of a radio that had survived too much. If you listened long enough, the data resolved into frames. Not images, exactly. Structures. Matrices that implied a geometry that did not map onto anything in our reals.
No stars. No horizons. No bodies.
The matrices looked like the memory of a network. Mira sat in a cafeteria that had been built to look like anywhere, with steel chairs and the kind of art nobody remembers seeing. She ate something that tasted like a factory. Her hands could not decide whether to rest or work, so they did a little of both. She had a note in her pocket in someone else's handwriting.
It said, Echo 9. It said, Ort thermal spikes.
It said, ignore, prioritize public comm. She did not know if the note was true. She did not know if she was being played. It felt like the kind of lie only truth can produce. In those days, silence became policy. The silence was defended by men and women who would have sworn, at any other hour, that silence is the weapon of cowards. Their silence had footnotes. Their silence was responsible.
Panic is real.
Markets are fragile. Order is precious. And yet, the oldest reason hummed under every memorized talking point: we do not know. Human things went on their way with human stubbornness. Flights landed and took off. Cooks salted water, and children used wooden spoons as swords in apartments where the neighbors were tired and kind. Somewhere in Brazil, just under where the thing hung, the sea turned still for an hour as if it had inhaled and forgot how to let go. Fishermen stopped their engine and listened to the pitch of their propellers change even when they were not moving. Phones twitched, compass apps stuttered and spun as if they had been insulted.
Animals peit attention first.
Whales held notes longer in the southern Atlantic, their songs bunched into patterns that made no evolutionary sense but felt like patterns the way a stranger's face can feel familiar for reasons you cannot do the math for. Bees lost and then recovered their straight lines.
Birds flew lower.
The sky looked exactly the same right up until the moment you realized you had never really been looking. After 3 days of absolute immobility, Oumuamua moved.
It did not thrust. It did not burn. There was no flash.
Its position ticked 0.5 degrees in longitude, a shift so absurdly precise that the coffee Mira was lifting to her mouth stalled halfway to her lips. At almost the same instant, low-frequency reports stacked themselves from stations that had never shared a football game, let alone a heartbeat.
Evertierte in Sekunds, a whisper. Then again. And again.
The pattern was a map of the first map, primes. A cadence that could not be misunderstood. The interval did not waver. The new position overhead matched, to within a meter, a place where the planet's own invisible lines not. We had charts for magnetic anomalies. We had names we used at conferences and forgot by lunch. It turned out our world kept a handful of natural amphitheaters for fields, places where a voice could be carried farther by the geometry of the thing being spoken through. The object had found one. Or it had always known about it. Or we were telling ourselves this story because there are only so many choices for how you explain the feeling of being anticipated. Adeyemi's inbox had filled with emails from people who did not use email for anything this urgent. He printed none of them. Instead, he called a number written in the corner of an old notebook, the one you keep for phone numbers that belong to the part of your life that lets you sleep. The man at the other end spoke in a tone he would have used at a funeral. We think the thing is not a thing, the man said. We think it is a node.
A node.
A word you can put in the mouth and hold there until it dissolves, leaving a chemical aftertaste. The internet is made of nodes. The brain is made of nodes. Networks are nodes and edges carry messages, and messages define a world as surely as rocks do. You can knock a node out and the network can heal. You can knock more out and the network can reroute. You can build a network to watch itself, until the watching makes a mirror. And in the first fragment of rumor, someone with a restless mind and none of the comforts of certainty gave the thought a name.
The mirror.
The theory was not complicated.
It was insulting.
The object was not a spacecraft. It was a mirror tuned to reflect a very particular kind of light, the signature of what we are technologically, conceptually, maybe even morally. It was a device that caught our loudest inventions, our loudest mistakes, our loudest ambitions, and pointed them back through the fabric of its network with an accuracy we had never attained in sending anything to anyone on purpose. Mira read the paper nobody would admit writing. The mirroring hypothesis had a section that made her feel that rarest of emotions, loved. It said we had been interesting enough to be watched. It said we had been kept from harm when harm would have made us less interesting. It said there is a difference between patience and mercy. She closed her laptop and put her forehead on her desk. She did not cry.
She did not sleep.
She listened to the air vents. She listened as if the room itself was a speaker and the world was playing something too quiet to catch unless you believed in quiet. All over the planet, the hum of the thing and the hum of our answers interwove. Satellite constellations, those beaded strings of cameras and radios, reported little hitches as if the sky had developed a stutter. New folklore sprouted from old soil. People who had always known how to read signs, because ignorance is a luxury, learned new ones. A grandmother in the steppes put her palm to the dirt and told her grandson the earth had a fever. He nodded, because he was 10, and 10 is that age when everything adults say could be true. The official silence began to crack in the only way it ever does.
Leaks were not water. They were ice.
A memo with the codename Echo 9 depressed the pulse of a dozen underpaid hearts across 3 agencies. It suggested weak, intermittent thermal flickers at the lip of the Oort cloud had been noticed and set aside months before the hole in the web frames. Because the scientists were not evil. They were ordinary. Because to admit you saw something like a nail hammered through space is to take responsibility for how every jittery person on Earth will sleep. The memo was allergic to panic. It was also allergic to shame. It did not accuse. It did not apologize. It did what memos do.
It justified.
In Cape Town, Valentina Ordonez locked her family's observatory at midnight and went back up to the instruments, slow and careful to avoid waking the dog. She had lost a grant because she did not know how to be polite to men who didn't listen. She was good with machines because she listened in the way machines like, with patience and without fear of being bored. She saw the same dragging gash of absence in the sky, and yet the feeling carried a new weight. The absence was now a presence in her days. It made knocking sounds in the dishwasher. It made the pantry light flicker. It made the empty glass on the table feel important. She tuned to the object's frequency by trying to be unimagined. The instrument drifted. Then it locked with a soft click like 2 teeth meeting. She asked it nothing. It told her nothing. And still she left hours later with a notebook full of numbers that would turn out to fit the 13-second rhythm so neatly that even her least flattering critics would admit it in the comments when the paper finally saw light. The global argument that followed was an old argument, but it had new choreography. We had argued for centuries about whether we are alone. We had written poems about it and burned women for it and casually joked about it in bars whose floors were sticky with spilled certainty. The mirror turned the question the way a child turns a toy to see if there is another way it comes apart. Not where are they? When will they decide we are worth talking to? Is worth the right word? Is talking the right verb? In locked rooms that looked alike in every capital, people who had been trained to be hard to scare, practiced being harder. One camp made a case for immediate, loud, naive communication. This camp had artists in it, and old ham radio operators, and a handful of people who had been waiting all their lives to be brave in exactly this way. The second camp was cautious in the way stone is cautious about falling. This camp had old soldiers in it, and zipliped mathematicians who had spent their lives trying to keep brittle systems from snapping, and civil servants who had learned that good intentions tend to set fires that are hard to put out. A third camp existed, as it always does, not as a formal thing but as a mood. This mood believed the mirror was a test. It believed in filters, gates, thresholds. It believed history is a series of doors, and that this one had our name written on it in ink that didn't run. It called itself practical. It sounded like fear given a haircut. The veil hypothesis walked into this mood like a woman into a crowded room, confident because she had something to say, not because she felt welcome. It suggested that the mirror was not watching biology, at least not directly. It suggested machines like these woke not for life, but for a quality of attention life can acquire only when its tools teach it new ways to see itself. It called that quality what it had to call it to please the physicists: phase space, criticality, coherence. Everyone else called it something softer, a crossing. If you were inclined to poetry, you could say the mirror woke when we stopped being asleep to ourselves. Days piled like folded paper.
More pulses came.
The patterns layered, a braid in which the strands never touched but somehow stayed together. Neutrino detectors blinked in a way they had never blinked. Instruments built to catch particles that hardly ever bother to care about matter suddenly seemed to flinch like animals in a thunderstorm. The faintest change in timing made men in labs sit on the floor with their hands in their hair. Voyager 2, the quieter brother, sent a cough into the network that was not a cough. The packet timestamps slid into the same groove as the Earth pulses, down to the millisecond in a way that made statisticians search for flaws they hoped to find. It is not that the math was beyond us. It is that the intent behind the math felt older than our verbs. It was like being in a room with someone whose language you do not speak, but whose tone is clear. I heard you. I see you. I see the way you listen. Mira flew to a conference that officially did not exist. Her badge had her name spelled wrongly, as if that could keep consequences from finding her. The room was set to the kind of cold that keeps expensive equipment honest. On the second day, a woman from an agency that never gives interviews stood and spoke words nobody else could have spoken without being laughed at.
It will not attack. It will not warn.
It will only measure, she said. And by measuring, it will cause us to measure ourselves. Which is a kind of attack, or a kind of gift. Adeyemi was there too. He had the kind of suit that made the people with government budgets look at him and assume he held a small, reliable tool that the machine could not run without. He smiled at Mira without smiling. Later in the hallway, they ate standing up, because chairs felt decadent when the planet itself had become an instrument. Have you ever felt, he asked, that we are inside a map we did not draw?
Every day, she said.
But today feels like the map can see us. At night, in cities and towns and villages and ships, people dreamed. Dreams are cheap, and they are human, and telling other people to take your dreams seriously is impolite. Still, enough mouths woke with the taste of numbers in them that it became its own kind of data.
Tierten Seekongs.
The cadence of the thing arrived in sleep. Children hummed it without knowing why, the way children sing the chorus of a song they overheard through a wall. Myra's niece counted at dinner. She made it a game. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. She smiled as if she had remembered the name of someone she liked. Mira excused herself and stood in the bathroom with both palms on the sink, as if she had to hold it steady. Valentina got an email from an old rival who had once called her a fraud in public and then refused to shake her hand.
He apologized.
He attached preliminary data on a ring laser gyroscope that had started to drift, then to drift the other way, as if it had been teased by a finger flicked through space that left no trace. She printed the graphs and taped them to her refrigerator and drank a beer with the lights off. The first broadcast we sent, the one that everyone later agreed had been foolish and brave, was not an official broadcast. It was made by amateurs, as the most important broadcasts often are. They pooled money and time and whatever old dishes they could resurrect on hills too far from anyone who could tell them not to. They took care in their way. They did not aim higher power than makes sense. They composed a message that was a definition of us designed by people who understood that definitions are a thing we invent because the world is too much. Math. Music. A picture of our star with 3 silent planets, and a 4th noisy one, a little joke, the kind you can live with. The mirror did not answer. The mirror simply kept time.
Another Tierten Seekongs. And another.
The interval became a prayer you did not know you had learned until you realized you were keeping it with your pulse. The pulses did something to radio band noise that engineers would later describe as a combing, as if the mirror were straightening spectra for ease of reading. The action reminded everyone with the right kind of trauma of a teacher smoothing a child's hair before a school picture.
CERN published. The paper was careful.
It was that special brand of careful that only exists when people know they are right and afraid.
The curves were there.
The components of the signal were there. The note that said no known terrestrial or solar source was there. Heavier was what lived between sentences. We do not know why this would be done, unless the thing doing it cares about the timing of our attention.
The timing mattered.
The pulses arrived when the world could count them. When the DSN was listening. When the magnetometers were awake. When we would notice. Either that, or we were forcing a story on noise because it is what we do. It is hard to tell the difference in the moment between a story and a signal. That is why we build instruments. The first time a person saw the mirror with naked eyes is a story that will be told slowly for as long as we have breath to argue. He was on a cargo ship in the Atlantic. He had eyes that could see tiny things in a big sky. The night was new black. He said the stars flickered. He said the flicker had a pattern, if you held your breath and let the whole head, not just the eyes, go loose. He said he saw a line in nothing. He drew it on the back of a receipt with a pen that failed halfway. The drawing looked like nothing. It looked like everything. We grew bolder and more ridiculous. We sent whole symphonies in compressed form in the naive faith that music is a language of the bold and ridiculous. We sent recipes. We sent the geometry of our prime detectors and a sketch of the way our weakness for war distorts the signals we hope to show as clean.
Wir sind Promises.
There are promises you can keep. There are promises you make because you want the person you are promising to exist.
The mirror kept time.
A team in Japan built models that made the hair on the necks of their friends stand up. The geometry looked like a mesh of a mesh. Space was overlaid with a second space whose edges did not cut but threaded. Every system with planets might have been dressed in this soft web, a net not for catching fish but for catching meaning. We had never seen it because we had never made enough noise in the right keys. The day we did, the nearest knot in the net glowed, not with light but with the raising of attention. It was not coming to us. We had come to it, slowly, by learning to listen to ourselves. We had stumbled into our own reflection. By now the silence from the men who had built careers on explaining the world had a texture. It was an act performed daily.
Some stopped pretending.
A famous TV physicist wrote, in a post that read like the first confession of an honest liar, if this is a net of watchers, it means less about them than it does about us. The most frightening thing it tells me is that we are interesting for reasons that are beyond our current taste. He was eaten alive by both sides.
He deserved it. He expected it.
If there was a moment you could point to and say, that was the hinge, it might be the same morning every car radio in a 5-country sweep lost the station at the same second.
No panic. No crash. Just det Then a click.
Then the station again, as if nothing had happened.
The click lasted 0,72 seconds.
It was almost funny. People were late to work and laughed and told each other, in the ways that cultures tell themselves things that later appear in footnotes, that even the airwaves had to blink. We are not owed a narrative. The mirror did not owe us one. It was executing a ritual that we were not the first to trigger and, if we were lucky, would not be the last. The thought that we were not even special in our being measured was not insulting. It was the least frightening version of the story. The other versions tug at the sleeve. They say, perhaps this is not a test but a tally. Perhaps someone is not grading but counting. Perhaps graduation is not the thing we think it is. Perhaps the only winners are those who refuse to enroll. There was a day a crowd gathered on a beach in Ghana. Adeyemi stood near the back with his hands in his pockets. A woman with a portable radio balanced on her knee read numbers out loud as if she was reading a recipe, her voice thick and full of a music that belongs at markets and wakes. Children ran in and out of the ocean. The waves added their own beat. The 13 seconds came and went. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of day. It was the kind of day when you agree, silently and without paperwork, to the idea that whatever happens next will happen to all of us, so we might as well start acting like all of us are real. 2 weeks after the first blank frames, the object's edges softened once, like someone relaxing.
The heat bubble flexed.
The low-frequency pattern rewrote itself without changing its melody. Banded across the spectrum, a series of tiny variances appeared timed to human infrastructure cycles. Power grids.
Comm schedules.
Air traffic control windows. The mirror was learning our habits. Or rather, it was letting us see that it had always known a type of habit, and was now lowering the filter so the lessons would be shared. That is what a mirror does when you step closer. It stops showing the room, and shows more of you. A very small group of people in a cramped room had a very reasonable conversation. They said, if it is a mirror, and it reflects our loudness back into the network, then we should be careful about what loudness we choose. This was the sort of thought that sounds like wisdom and feels like shame. They turned down transmitters. They cancelled tests. They asked for patience. They used the word prudent a lot. Prudent is always a word you can put on a t-shirt and sell. Something happened to the whales again.
Their calls subdivided.
The intervals between phrases aligned with the Earth pulses in a way that would be dismissed by anyone whose job was to dismiss things, except that the pattern held for 4 days across 3 pods in different oceans. A marine biologist with the look of someone who has been waiting for permission to say something impossible said something impossible on camera. The clip went viral and ruined her career and made her a profit. She said, "We always knew they were listening to something we did not hear. Maybe now we hear it a little together. Maybe that is the work."
So the work began.
Not the cutting of wires. Not the building of bigger antennas.
That came anyway.
The work of deciding, without a vote, what it would mean to be seen correctly. It was not the work governments know how to do, though some tried. It was not the work markets can price.
It was soft work.
It was the work children do when they choose teams and don't let anyone be picked last. It was the work of speaking less as noise and more as signal. This sounds like a slogan. It was 1,000 small choices, none of which made a good headline. We learned to count without panicking. We learned to time our experiments to say we are curious in a uniform voice instead of a chorus of contradiction. A company that makes satellites for pictures of cities at night offered to lend capacity to ocean researchers because ships are loud in ways we had not noticed. A country that had spent decades pretending it could do without its neighbors invited those neighbors to the table to coordinate the pulses of their power plants. The invitation did not erase the past. It drew a small line under the present and handed out pens. The mirror did what mirrors do when the person in front of them adjusts posture. It adjusted too.
The signal smoothed.
The variance in the 13-second interval dropped.
The radio comb sharpened.
The packet complexities arriving along the old Voyager channels increased in a way that made translators out of electrical engineers.
More matrices.
Some looked like slices of something vast. Slices suggest a whole. The whole suggested nothing we could hold without it falling apart in our hands, like a bird too frantic to understand help. We told ourselves stories to sleep. They were the same stories, retold cleaner, or retold dirtier, or retold with jokes, because sometimes the only way to keep breath steady is to make laughter do the work the lungs cannot. In one story, the mirror was a judge. In another, it was a gate. In a third, it was just an elderly machine doing the job of a surveyor whose arm got tired sometime back when mountains were still finding their final shape. In the mornings, after dreams with numbers, people wrote down recipes they loved. They shared them with strangers. The strangers cooked the food. They ate in apartments with chairs pulled close. This spiritual practice did nothing to improve the precision of our instruments. It did something to the precision of our aim. 2 months in, what we had been pretending not to fear was put on the table in a room without cameras. Someone said, "What if the silence is the verdict?"
Not a pause. Not a breath.
The verdict. What if the absence of a voice saying welcome is the way the network keeps peace? You do not tell the loud child at the library to come sit in the circle. You wait until the child learns the difference between sound and noise.
Then you talk.
The person who asked the question did not sleep well later. The question drew swift answers with teeth. Other people who had picked up hammers when their job description had said nothing about hammers, said, "Then let's show it we can distinguish the two." They designed an experiment. They made it simple, because hope likes simple better. They coordinated a global modulation of our own noise. The grid would hum softer at a chosen moment. The satellites would rest.
The nets would close.
The silly, thrilling, impossible plan was to make the Earth inhale. Then at the 0.72-second mark exhale in unison. Someone made a joke about the planet doing yoga. Everyone laughed in a way that forgave the person the joke had come through. At the chosen moment, the lights did not go out. Modern life does not tolerate such things well. Instead it shaved edges. Elevators paused between floors for a breath. Trains slowed into stations as if someone had admired the scenery. Cities dimmed the non-essential LEDs that make night look like a cheap dream opal. In kitchens, in the seconds leading up to the mark, a billion fingers lifted off a billion screens with the sheepish embarrassment of people who do not want to be caught holding a phone during a foxhole conversation.
The mirror kept time.
We kept it with it. There was a hum like the sound your head makes when you are falling asleep on a bus and the bus passes under a bridge that has seen too much rain.
The sound stopped. The planet inhaled. It exhaled.
The packets along the Voyager channels surged, then clarified. The matrices opened like flowers in fast-forward.
They were much the same.
But they had a new feature. Embedded in the frames was something that looked like an index.
A cross-reference.
A notation for places where nets had been raised on other nights around other suns. We did not recognize any of the catalogued stars.
That was the point, If there was a point.
The point was that we weren't alone. Not just in breathing under a cold network. In having breathed well enough to be measured for real. You could argue, and many did, that we had fooled ourselves again. That the matrices could be noise parsed by a civilization that wanted meaning too much. You could argue, if you wanted your evenings to be full of never being touched by wonder, that the thing overhead was a drone dropped by bored gods who left long ago, with a timer that wakes it when any local life learns to count. You could argue that our coordination experiment would have happened to fall near a scheduled change in the mirror's behavior, and that we were the sort of species that builds altars to non-events. You could argue that.
People did. And maybe they were right.
The suspicious mind is a gift we give ourselves to guard against the blindness that killed our grandparents. The loving mind is the gift that teaches us why the guard should sometimes sleep. Adeyemi wrote a letter to a friend he had not seen in 20 years. In the letter, he told the truth, the way you can when there is nothing left to lose that matters in the same way it used to. He said, "It feels like standing at a river after a long walk in dust, and seeing a boat on the far bank.
It is too far to swim. It is too far to shout. The boat does not come."
That tells me nothing about the boatman. It tells me everything about whether I am ready to cross. Mira went back to the first frames, though everybody told her it was bad for her. She watched the hole appear in a patch of darkness that was not, actually, dark. She watched the absence write itself over the presence like a hand drawing a curtain. She thought of all the nights she had believed the only rule was that equations must be balanced by what we already know. She closed her eyes and saw numbers like a line of ants, purposeful, small, connected by invisible intent. Valentina finished the paper that would be given 100 names and headlines and 1 honor in the long history of people trying to speak clearly about things that make clear speech seem like vanity. She titled it Nothing. She sent it to an archive that lives on servers in rooms whose vents hum just like every other room that hosts an archive. It said, "Here is what I saw. Here is what I did to see it. Here is how wrong I may be, and here is why I could be wrong, and here is why even wrong the seeing might be useful." It was beloved and hated in equal measure by people who like the taste of certainty and people who like the taste of blood. Another day. Another 13 seconds. Another ocean flattened then forgot. Another toddler counted very solemnly to a number he did not technically know and clapped when he was done because ending is a skill children practice without shame. Another radio station clicked. There are stories that end. There are stories you end. There are stories that you carry because ending them would mean ending the person you have become by carrying them. The mirror story is a mirror. That is the only clean sentence you can write about it. It has only ever told us, beautifully and cruelly, what we would say if someone gave us the chance to hear ourselves as we actually are, timed against a measure we did not set. In Accra, on a night when the heat finally broke, Adeyemi walked home by a different route and past a church that had always been loud and hopeful and wrong. The doors were open. The pews were full. The preacher had put his hands on the lectern and was saying nothing. The congregation was saying nothing. They were measuring their silence against the world. They were hearing themselves. He sat in the last pew for a minute and thought about making a choice. Then he left, because choices you make only because other people are watching, even if the watcher is the sky, are not choices. Days later, the mirror shifted again. Not in position. In intimacy. The pulses began to modulate with a tone at the edge of hearing. Children heard it first, then dogs, then very old men who had grown up far from cities. Videos appeared and were dismissed and then archived and then studied. The tone was not a tone. It was a gentle alternate timing that made you breathe slower if you did not fight it. A suggestion. An invitation. A way to see if the animal in us still remembered how to live without the metronome of panic. The animal did. Some of the time. A dozen governments convened a formal panel of people who liked being called formal panels. Their report said, "There is no evidence this is harming us. There is no evidence it is not." That was true and also criminally boring. The public read other things, because the public has always known how to keep itself alive despite its own elites. Poems like instruction manuals. Instruction manuals like lullabies. Jokes that worked like prayers. As the third month melted into the fourth, as the 13 seconds wound our days around a pillar none of us had seen coming, as the old probes kept receiving and we kept sending and the noise of our lives kept turning into a grammar the mirror could parse, a thought took root that at first embarrassed the people who said it out loud. Maybe the point isn't to get a reply. Maybe the point is to learn to speak. If the mirror is a gate, the gate opens onto a road that requires language we do not yet possess. Not syntax. Not vocabulary. Not a set of symbols. The language of a planet that can say, With a voice composed of 9 billion mouths and an infrastructure of thunderstorms and fiber optic cables and quiet kitchens and angry streets, we can be measured and not be broken by the news. We may fail at that. It is so much easier to shout than to speak. It is so much easier to burn than to cook.
But ease is a poor tutor.
We had been students of ease for too long. The mirror's offer, if offer is not too grand a word for passive, pitiless observation, was to become students of something more difficult. What if the silence is not the verdict? What if the silence is the syllabus? There are days when the sky over the Pacific is the flat blue of an old bruise, and days when it looks like a mirror itself, and someone somewhere will always wonder why we tell ourselves stories about objects in the sky when our actual problem is people on the ground. That someone is not wrong. But the human animal is built to look up and ask why, because asking why about the sky is how we learn to ask why about anything at all. The mirror has not cured greed. It has not forgiven cruelty.
It will not. It cannot. It has no hands.
It has only this strict timing and this ruthless attention. It asks nothing, and by asking nothing, asks everything. And still, if you stand in a quiet room in the hour before dawn when the world's machines are at their lowest tide, if you put your hand on a wall and keep it there until the pulse you barely feel becomes the thing you are feeling, if you send your breath to find the 13 seconds, you may catch it.
The click. The global blink. The hum.
The counting that does not count anything you can pile or own. And you may, if you are the sort of person who has been made blunt by being alive too long, feel a forgiveness that does not come from a god or a neighbor or a headline. A forgiveness that comes from knowing that, even if no one else ever speaks back, we could learn to be the people who deserve an answer. On a clear night over the desert, Valentina pointed her instrument not at the object itself but to a point of nothing just to one side, a habit she had picked up from painters who know that edges tell you more than surfaces. The trace rolled. Settled. She felt it in her kneecaps, the way you do when a train approaches before it makes a sound. She smiled without realizing it, the kind of smile people wear when they have just heard a joke and haven't decided if it is funny. The hum arrived on time. 13 seconds. Elsewhere, in rooms you have been in 1,000 times, with carpets that lie about what has been spilled on them and walls that have been painted the color of compromise, people met and decided not to decide. They have always been good at that. The mirror did not care. It had all the time that exists. If you had asked Mira that first day, in the bright cold room with the disappearing images, what she wanted, she would have said, "I want to know what it is." She would not say that now. She would say, "I want to be worth it." She does not know what it is, but she knows what she is for. She is for making the noise into signal. She is for keeping the count. She is for training her attention to a blade and then not using it to cut anything that cannot heal. In Ghana, Adeyemi took his niece to the ocean. They stood and let the water take up their ankles and put them down again. The girl counted the waves because at that age everything is a chance to count.
He did not stop her. He counted with her.
He counted to 13 and did not stop. He went on, not because primes are magic, but because counting is. Every number we share is a bridge. Every bridge we build fulfills the oldest promise we make to each other and do not keep nearly enough: I will meet you halfway.
The mirror kept time.
The world kept it too. And if that is all the ending we ever get, it is not nothing. It is an attention we learned to pay together. It is the beginning we did not know we were authorized to make. It is us in chorus, under a sky that has found a way to look back, asking the only question that matters once the counting has steadied your hands.